Money Conference stage. As he mentioned, the next big concept in fintech. Now, Carey, you are working on the Bank of the Future, and Melissa, you're investing in fintechs here in Asia. For you, how do you see the Bank of the Future?
That's a big question, Melissa. Yeah. I think many of us have different points of view of what the Bank of the Future is. But when we start to anticipate where we want to go as an organization, and specifically in Citi, I mean, there's no doubt that the disruption that has happened in each of the sectors of financial services has caused us to reimagine the type of company that we need to be, particularly with our global footprint. And part of that is, and you've heard a lot of this, is understanding what the customer needs are and really working from the outside in. But it's also trying to imagine what the world will look like 5-10 years from now when money starts to become invisible and transactions that happen in our day-to-day life that we habituate now become transactions that start to notify us that they've happened or give us pre-warnings before they happen, before they actually do. I think Uber's been an example of that, where there's no friction at all in what happens with money exchange, and we see that evolving not just in the payment space but in the wealth services space as well. Insurance, you've heard a lot of that from Ping Am of what's happening there, and anticipating what that is and building towards that is part of our objective.
Okay, Melissa, you've looked at a lot of fintechs in Asia. Is WeChat the bank that we're looking at of the future? Is that kind of how we're going to be developing?
So we'll step back just for a minute, and we asked ourselves last year, because every year we try to challenge ourselves to think about what's going to change about the future. And so we asked ourselves about what are the largest populations in the world today. And what's interesting is that only 3 are countries that are defined by a government, a reported GDP number, or a geography. And the rest of them are now social networks. Mm-hmm. And so then you start to think about how these social networks start to transform services and even banking or insurance and wealth management. And so if you then take it one step further and you say, what's the largest bank in the world today? It's WeChat. And then take that beyond and say, what banks, 3 banks have 1 billion customers? It's Ant, WeChat, and Uber. And now we're seeing the rise of non-bank banks. And so that's how we think about things. We think about the macro level. How is the world changing? How are we redefining ourselves as societies or for different services? And so as we think about that, then we start to think about how payments start to change. They're now borderless. We start to think about banking services. We're going to see the rise of non-bank banks. And so we think about it in this context, and then we look for, startups that can actually change the world according to how we already are changing it.
So if it's about who owns the relationships, whether it's aggregators, social media, what then happens to banks? Are they just utility companies? How do they evolve to be more than that?
You want me to answer that one?
You can go first. I'll let you go first.
I'm actually going to comment on what Melissa had just said. Is part of the recognition of being a large institution that's been around for 200 years is when we started, banking was a destination. You had to go to the branch to drive an interaction, to do a transaction. The reality is it's not. And I don't foresee it being in the near future. And so when you look at those populations of where are consumers, where do they live their lives, you have to find a way to be there with them. And part of that is unbundling the services that you have. Other aspects of it, it's really starting to challenge us to say, what is the additional value we're going to create on top of what's being commoditized? Because it is being commoditized. And so part of the investigative approach forward is really deepening our understanding of is there disruption in certain experiences with startups that we need to partner with, and sometimes it's without having the big brand, and it is about white labeling or co-branding, and then where are others where the consumers really do trust the brand, and we need to show up, and I think in a more obvious way, but we need to figure out where to be where the consumers are and adding value on top of that network.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I think it's a great question, and And the way we thought about it, if you think about some of these challenger banks, they've been really good at getting early adopters, and they can get, a couple of thousand, maybe 20, 30,000 accounts, but that doesn't build the next city. So, then we thought about, okay, these challenger banks, are they really being successful, or are they just, they're still sitting on top of somebody's rails because of regulation, so they're an aggregator of small groups of people. But then you turn your attention away and say, well, wait a second, Square is going to start a bank, Square Bank, and you have Uber. So maybe these non-bank banks are not the challenger banks, but maybe there's their aggregation of flows. And where do they go eventually? I think they'll get some banking licenses, but I think, to the point is that at some point, as they get scaled to a certain size, they're going to have to deal with the regulatory environment, and then I think they end up partnering with the large institutions who understand a lot of these aspects. But I don't think banks go away. I think we see the rise of non-bank banks and these partnerships. And I think that is clearly the difference between FinTech 1.0 and FinTech 2.0. 1.0 was all about, we're going to kill the banks. In FinTech 2.0, it's about partnerships. And so that's how we see it.
Yeah, I will add to that. I was in Dubai about a couple months ago, and one of the gentlemen on the panel that I was facilitating was from TransferWise. And he had got up and he had talked about the importance of partnerships. And if any of you remember some of the TransferWise marketing media events that they had where it was down with banks, I definitely took the opportunity to call them out on looks what's transpired. And the reality is if you really want to meet the customer's needs, you've got to find a different path forward. Because just like Melissa said, that you've got Clarity Money and others that literally have created 200,000 accounts in the first 3 months. But where's the business model? Where's the economics? And how do we, from a regulatory perspective and the things that we do really, really well, partner with them to actually deliver what's needed?
Okay. If you do, let's say this partnership happens between banks and non-banks. Are we going to see other services growing, say the robo-advising area? Is this something that you see as a huge growth area? Is it going to be a premium or your kind of standard level service? And is this something that you as an investor are really interested in, or do you see maybe some downside to it?
Go ahead, Melissa.
We do not invest in robo-advisors. And here's the reason why. It's really simple, is that you need at least 40 billion of AUM to become relevant in the world of asset management today. And if you take Wealthfront and Betterment, two fantastic companies, what are they at 8 billion today? It's a long ride. And plus, if you look at their valuations are way ahead of where they are from AUM to become really sizable. And we have not seen terrific exits in the robo-advisory space. So as a venture capitalist, I don't like the space for investing today. It could change. I think AR and VR may change that space completely, so I'm there. But do I think that robo-advisories the service is incredibly important for established asset management firms and banks? Absolutely. It makes total sense. And I want to just separate. Sometimes there's great investment opportunities for venture capitalists. Sometimes it doesn't make sense for a VC from a return perspective, but it absolutely makes sense for a large institution from a technology adoption perspective.
Yeah, I would second that. I mean, it's a spectrum when we start to, first of all, you look at robo-advisory. There's robo-advisory and there's robo-investing, right? And you do have to separate the two. The Betterments, the Wealthfronts of the world have a combination of each. Robo-advisory, I look at some of the new technologies, whether it's artificial intelligence or other aspects, where how do we start to engage with our consumers further upstream? So when you look at managing the funnel, typically the large institutions and the banks are only there when a transaction needs to happen. The reality is consumers have started to get accustomed to in other industries of trial before using, trial before engaging in a relationship. And so our belief is we have to figure out how to engage with them further upstream as they're making those critical decisions in their financial lives. Part of that is around new entrants into investing and doing it in a way that's simple, doing it in its way where there's not a lot of downside and a lot of risk, and doing it in a way where you can educate them along the way. But it is a spectrum. Robo-advisory versus handheld, white glove, private wealth management, we will always have that spectrum. I think our goal is to figure out what's going to meet their need depending on where they are at a given time.
Right. We had talked a little bit earlier about how banking is really becoming borderless. In this sense, where do you look for inspiration when you're thinking about how banking will evolve and how fintech might evolve?
I mean, I'll briefly touch on that. I mean, I look, so I'm a big believer in reverse innovation, where, and particularly being an American and in the US, I think there are many times we're very myopic about what's happening in the States, happening in the rest of the world. That is absolutely not true. I mean, you see it here in China, you see it in Africa, you see it in India, where they haven't had the boundaries or the limitations of what has prohibited us to be innovative in the States. And so a lot of what you're seeing in these emerging markets where they have an opportunity to potentially leapfrog some of the traditional services is very inspirational for me. So looking outside and figure how do you take that in? How do you look at pay-as-you-go services in the banking sector like you've seen in some of the emerging markets? How do you think about showing up in these large ecosystems where we don't have that in the States? I think becomes very, very relevant to what we need to do day in, day out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think on the inspiration side, it's removing your own boundaries of your own mind, right? I think, we challenge the team constantly and ourselves to think about what is next, what is possible, where do we go in a borderless world of transactions, a borderless world of how we now interact on social networks. That drives the future. And so I think if you can remove those borders, then you can start to think about what is possible and actually what is happening, and we're seeing it as we speak. I mean, cross-border e-commerce, $1 trillion with 1 billion shoppers by 2020. Who would have thought that 5 or even 10 years ago? And so I think our inspiration comes from these changes, and then we try to think about the startups that can serve, the new world we're going to live in.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I would add, Melissa, too, I think it's looking at other industries, at least in the financial sector. So if you look at the media sector, if you look at the e-commerce sector, if you look, there's all these other industries that have gone through a similar transformation like the financial sector has. And with media, it was, buy a big bundle and consume everything. And then it completely became fragmented and you could pay as you needed. And so inspiration, I think, needs to come from seeing what's happened before that's not necessarily in your industry. It's completely outside.
Right. Do you see a lot of, obviously there's a lot of innovation in China. Are there a lot of interesting fintechs that you see there and ideas coming out?
It's not only China, it's everywhere in the world today. I mean, I think China, if you look at the alternative lending sector, they redefined the boundaries of alternative lending. I mean, Lufax is by far the largest in the world. And then you look now at the wealth management aspects of that. So they've taken alternative lending and married it with wealth management. That was not done in the U.S. So, there's a great example where China led the world. China has led the world as far as payments go. Mm-hmm. I mean, the fact that digital wallets, you can leave your house and you don't need a wallet. You can use your WePay or WeChat account for everything. So I think China has clearly led the way, and partially that's the government has been very forward-thinking to let these industries grow up without tremendous amounts of regulation day one, and then come back in and regulate as necessary. But I would say it's not only China. We're seeing a lot of innovation now in Southeast Asia. I think that will continue. And, if you think about Japan, no one thinks about Japan necessarily as an innovation center. They're the world's leader in Bitcoin and as far as regulation goes. So regulation happens all over the world. As an American, I would say at some point in my life I had that issue as well. But having lived here now for over 10 years, innovation in financial services, I think, is driven more outside of the U.S. than inside the U.S. today. Mm-hmm.
Is that because these emerging markets precisely don't have a lot of these regulations? So you can foster these new ideas, and then as you see them growing, put down regulations when you see them needed.
I think its legacy infrastructure doesn't exist.
Yeah.
I think, just if you take the infrastructure, if it doesn't exist, you get to create it new. You get to build it on the latest technology at the lowest cost, and you can build in SaaS models from day one. I think the U.S., the infrastructure has existed for a long time.
Well, and the infrastructure and the risk that has been associated with that, good or bad, with a lot of the security fraud and money fraud that you've seen happen around the world. But I will say part of the issue is, regulation can play an amazing role in driving innovation. It's when you're regulating before the issue happens, where you're actually regulating out innovation. When you do have some of these emerging markets and you get to create net new and you have a broader net of what you can create, and then it's controlled, where you're not putting society at risk, I think becomes really important. But you look at Estonia, you look at Dubai, you look at places where the government, India, played a role in driving a digital identity. And you've seen just this incredible acceleration of what has happened in the financial sector because of that. I mean, that's fantastic regulation that serves a purpose.
You had mentioned, both of you had mentioned digital currency, I think, or you had mentioned digital currency. Do you think that this is the way it's going, and are we moving towards one currency, or is it just all currencies digital on one system?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, who could guess that? I think the innovation that's going to be interesting is that the blockchain is simply a new database structure with messaging built in, and I think what we're going to see is new database structures emerge that will probably replace the blockchain. But the fact that you can think about a database structure in almost a three-dimensional way with messaging built in is an interesting innovation. But I couldn't guess about cryptocurrencies, but they're here and people are trading them, and so it's part of reality.
Okay. Any last words on the bank of the future or the next great innovation in fintech?
I'm not going to comment on the bank of the future because it could be so many things for so many people, but I think that we are going to see a heavy emergence of the incumbents playing an active role in partnering with those that have disrupted us. And Melissa said it earlier, where you have these single use case providers and they do it really, really, really well, but what transpires is they need either more capital structure or they need to build new services to go the full end of what a financial kind of offering would be for a consumer or for a business. And so that partnership, I think, is what is going to be part of defining what our future is.
Okay.
I think we're in one of the greatest periods of innovation that we've been in the last probably 30 or 40 years across the world, and I think that's only going to continue. So to say it's one particular sector would be shortchanging another, but we're extremely optimistic about what we're seeing.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Carey and Melissa.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.